Hi everyone, Stjepan here. It's Friday, but this is not a middle game video. I'm starting a new concept and a new series on the channel, or I'm starting a new series of series. I'm going to be covering the games of 7 world champions, and each day of the week is going to be devoted to one world champion. Now I've put up a vote on Patreon for people to choose which 7 world champions they would like me to cover. Kramnik was the winner, so I'm covering him first, and each Friday a video is going to be devoted to Vladimir Kramnik. The concept is that I want to learn from the classics, I want to be covering the classics, and I think that would be very instructive for you guys. And I'm going to be covering the games of 7 world champions from their first recorded games. And today we are going to look at the first recorded game played by Vladimir Kramnik when he was 8 or 9 years old. So the idea is we are going to be following the development of 7 world champions from their earlier age. I'm only going to be covering classical games. We are not going to be looking at blitz or bullet or rapid or anything that's not classical chess. And hopefully this concept is going to be useful. Tomorrow is Fischer Day, then on Sunday it's Karpov, and you're going to see which other champions won the vote. You can check it out on Patreon. Now, every game I cover, I'm going to attach a PGN of the study where I wrote the notes on the game, and I'm going to post it on Patreon so you can have some extra material. Okay, let's start. I'm very excited, and I have to say that I'm happy that Kramnik won the vote because he is one of the players which I love and whose style I like a lot, but I don't know their games. And I was really afraid to cover their earliest games, like the first game ever played or ever recorded, but Kramnik's first game is so incredibly powerful and extremely precise for a boy of 9 that I was just astonished. The game is absolutely brilliant. Okay, before we start the series on Kramnik, let me just give you a brief intro. He was born in 1975. This game was played in 1984, so he was 8 or 9. He was the world champion he became the world champion in the year 2000, defeating Garry Kasparov. He defended his title in 2004 against Peter Leko, a very strong Hungarian player. And then in 2006, he defeated Veselin Topalov, who was at the time the reigning FIDE world champion. And as a result of that, Kramnik was the first player to hold a unified world championship title, so both the FIDE and the normal title. Okay, that's since Kasparov split from FIDE in 1993. In 2007, he was defeated by Vishy Anand. He lost the title, and he was ahead in the tournament, ahead of Kramnik. Okay, his peak rating was 28-17 in October of 2016, which is very recent considering his age. He was a very strong player until he stopped playing. He only stopped last year. He stopped recently. He stopped playing professionally. Okay, as a child, he studied in Botivnik's chess school, established by Mikhail Botivnik, where all the strongest players studied. Kasparov was there. Among others, the school is still active today, of course. Botivnik is not teaching anymore. His first notable result was a gold medal as the first reserve for the Russian Olympic team in 1992 in Manila, and that's brought a lot of controversy because he was only a FIDE master and nobody really expected a FIDE master to go and play in the Olympiad. Okay, he finished 5th in Linares in 1995, and he was a very strong player overall. His games are incredibly instructive, his style is incredibly instructive, and he is very well known for some variations and some openings. For example, the Berlin defense, which he used to defeat Garry Kasparov in the 2000 World Championship, 8.5, 6.5, became sort of his trademark. Now, his style was very correct, precise play, but when necessary, he would crush you with tactics. Okay, let's start. So the first game we are going to be looking at in the long series on Vladimir Kramnik is the game he played between Arsen Oganyan with black in 1984 in Belorechensk. So he was 8 or 9 years old, I'm not sure. Okay, so e4, Kramnik plays c5, we have knight f3, e6, d4, cd4, knight d4, and knight c6. We have the open Sicilian, and this is the Paulsen variation. Okay, his opponent played knight c3, and now there are a couple of moves. Queen c7 is the main move, a6 is the second most popular, stopping knight b5 immediately. You can also play knight f6, and all of these variations they are analyzed and written in the PGN. I don't want to waste too much time on them here. I'll just show you queen c7 briefly. So bishop to e3 is the main move, and now again a6 is played, and queen d2, knight f6 castles queenside for white, which is a sharp way to play. The alternative is bishop to e2, where white prepares to castle kingside, so after a6 castles kingside. Okay, and after knight c3, a6 is the second most popular, simply preparing b5 and preventing knight b5. In the game, though, Kramnik plays d6, which is probably the most solid and the most theoretical, because this now transposes to the Sozin attack most often. Okay, so after bishop to e3, developing and preparing queen to d2 and castles queenside. Here knight f6 is played, which is the main move, and now white has a couple of options. The main move is bishop to e2, so not going into the Sozin, but you can also play f3, preparing queen d2 and castles queenside. You can play f4, preparing queen f3 and a huge, very quick kingside attack. And you can also play queen to d2, simply preparing to castle queenside immediately, then follow it up with f3. But Kramnik's opponent played bishop to c4, transposing into the Sozin attack, one of Fischer's favorites. And in this position, you can play a6, transposing to the main lines, which would occur out of the Najdorf. But you can also avoid that. You don't have to play a6. You can play bishop e7 and sort of stubbornly avoids the move a6, so castles kingside, castles queenside, bishop to d7, and you basically claim that a6 would have been a waste of time and that you don't need the move. But Kramnik plays a6. Okay, bishop to b3, one of the main moves. Oh, excuse me. Queen to c7, developing the queen, and now queen to e2. The idea behind queen to e2 is to castle queenside, and the queen is better on e2 than on d2. Okay, bishop to e7 played, preparing to castle kingside perhaps, but mainly simply developing his pieces. Okay, castles queenside. And now this is the first point where Kramnik deviated from theory. There are two main moves here, either castles or knight a5. I think knight a5 is best. So after knight a5, g4, you can see the nature of the position. White is starting a kingside attack, and he wants to play g5, h4, f4, and basically crush black's king. And black has to do the same thing on the queen side. So black simply counters with b5, we have g5. You can take on b3 or play knight d7. Taking on b3 is more precise. And now knight d7, h4, and these lines are absolutely crazy. And white is visually better, and it seems that white will have a quicker attack and a more pleasant position. But black has a ton of counterplay, so b4, knight a4, the best move, but knight c5. And now the position after bishop d7 is very sharp, and black is going to have a5, a4, undermining the b3 pawn. He will have a ton of pressure on the c file, especially on the c2 pawn. And it basically comes down to who's quicker in this attack. Taking on c5 wouldn't be good because your knight would have to move. So king b1, getting away from the c file, and now bishop takes a4, b takes a4, rook to c8. You could take on a4, but rook to c8 is more precise. So now you can already see that even visually black is doing fine. So knight a5 I think is the best move. The alternative is simply castling kingside, which gives white a bit more time in the attack. But Kramnik played bishop d7, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with this move. The downside is that you sort of occupied the square your knight would like to be on, and you are controlling a4, which is an important square, but maybe b5, bishop b7 was better, because you need the retreat square for the knight, as we are going to see later on in the game. White plays f3, which is slightly strange. He wants to play g4, of course, so f3 is understandable. And now knight a5 played by Kramnik, and with this move we are out of book. The position is roughly equal. White should have an easier plan, just pushing the kingside pawns, but black will get the bishop pair and try to storm the white king with b5, b4, dislodge the c3 knight, attack the c2 square. And again, it should be a very sharp, very interesting position. Now again, let me remind you that Kramnik is 9 years old while playing this, and I find that completely incredible. So g4 played by Oganyan, starting his attack, knight b3. You can take with the a-pawn, but his opponent takes with the knight, which I don't think is so good, because a5, a4 now comes with tempo on the knight. And here, Kramnik had two moves which were better than what he did, but what he did is very understandable. I think the best move is simply b5, and after b5, g5 you play knight h5, and after f4 you play g6, defending the knight. Okay, so that was, I think, the best, simply going for an attack before your opponent gets his attack in. The alternative was to castle, and after g5, knight h5, again f4, g6, f5, ef5, ef5. Okay, I'll put that on the board. So castles, g5, knight h5, f4, g6. Now f5 was very interesting. So ef5, ef5, bishop f5 would have been a pawn sacrifice, but after knight d5, white has enough compensation for the pawn. Instead of that, Kramnik played a very human move, which is understandable for a child and sort of proves that he was human when he was 9. He played bishop c6. Now, this move firstly puts pressure on the rook, which is good, but the main idea is to give the knight the d7 square. And now we see the problem with playing knight d7 earlier on, and I thought this was a very, very interesting strategic point. Sometimes a natural move that we play sort of messes up our idea, and we have to compromise because of it. So here you can see why bishop d7 was slightly imprecise. He basically played two moves with his bishop instead of starting an attack. That being said, he is not much worse. White is slightly better. Okay, so g5, understandable, and knight d7, the point of bishop c6. And here white went wrong. What white should have done is simply h4, and after b5, a3 to stop b4, and then knight e5. So let's put that on the board. So h4, b5, a3, and now knight e5, h5, and white is quicker. There's no doubt about that. Black gets knight c4 in, but after f4, white's pawns are rolling forward, and even though the position should be equal, I believe it's much easier to play white here. Instead of that, his opponent played rook h to f1, which is a move I simply don't understand. Of course, the idea is probably to get away from the diagonal so that the rook is not hanging, but that's just too slow. The rook was perfectly placed on the h file, and he could have just continued the attack. So Kramnik now gained a bit of time and should be slightly better. b5. Okay, a3 to stop b4. And now rook b8 played by Kramnik, which is good. Simply getting the rook behind the b-pawn and starting an attack. But a very interesting continuation was knight c5, and this doesn't give white too many options. Taking is not good. Let's look at that first. So knight c5, dc5, and black would have had a very pleasant advantage. He's threatening b4 because the knight on a4 would now be hanging. So white would have to play something crazy like knight d5, and after takes, castles. Of course, you couldn't save a piece because bishop and queen were hanging. So something like this, and black is definitely slightly more pleasant here. The engines would say that it's equal, but I believe that black should have an advantage. So knight c5 was very interesting. Instead of that, he played rook b8, which is still a very, very good move, very sensible. f4. So now you can see the benefit of not having the rook on h1. You can play f5 and f6 without your rook hanging if the exchange happens. Okay, and b4. Still, he could have gone for this idea of knight c5, which I think was best. b4 is slightly imprecise. Knight c5, again, if you take it, that's not good. If you don't take it, I'm threatening to take on b3. The alternative was a5, which was very strong indeed. So after something like knight to d4, b4, Something like knight b5 would have given white an okay position, but I still think black's attack is quicker, and a5 was a very good move. Instead of that, he played b4 straight away. And now we have a b4, rook b4, and rook to d4. Rook to d4 is an attempt to go for an exchange, but Kramnik simply played a5, which is very good. So if you take, your knight moves away from the c3 square, and the c file becomes very very dangerous for white to handle. So I think rook d4 is an error. Instead, he should have continued with knight d4, attacking the bishop, and the bishop has to move. You don't have that much pressure on the b file anymore, and the position should be equal. Also, sometimes there are tricks on e6. But rook d4 and a5. In this position, he could have played a very nice tactic. I wonder if you can spot it. You can pause the video if you want to. So after rook d4, he could have played rook takes b3, and of course you have to take c takes b3, and now bishop to b5 simply wins the exchange back. If you move the queen, I take the f1 rook. If you block with the rook on c4, I take the rook. Your knight is pinned. So this would have been very, very good. Still, the position should be equal, but now visually you can see that black's position is much easier to play. But a5, as I said, very good, simply supporting the rook. Very human move, very natural. Rook fd1, now you can see that rook h to f1 was a huge waste of time. And here it's visible that black's pieces are flooding white's position. White is trying to seek counterplay, but on the wrong side of the board. If you brought your rooks back to the center and you're putting pressure on d6, why push all the kingside pawns? Now, white's place sort of doesn't make sense anymore, because he wasted a couple of tempi to start an attack on the king side, then he rerouted all his pieces to the center, and black is doing his queen side attack throughout the game, so it makes a ton of sense. And now that there is no danger on the king side, Kramnik simply castles. f5 seems dangerous, but black has ideas of his own. Knight c5. Okay, now white goes for a very interesting pawn sacrifice. What I believe is the best plan in the positions. He simply continues the kingside attack and weakens the d6 pawn by removing the bishop. He plays f6, and that's basically a pawn sacrifice for the initiative. Now, before taking on f6, Kramnik plays knight takes b3, and after c takes b3, now gf, and bishop f. And in this position, there are three very important things. Firstly, black is a pawn ahead. Secondly, white's remaining pawns and his pawn structure are completely demolished. He has 3 pawn islands, 2 isolated pawns, and a set of double isolated pawns, which is horrible. So if the pieces should get traded off, black would simply be winning. More importantly, his king is in a lot of trouble. That may not be obvious, that may not be tactically possible for the moment, but it's very hard to defend this. Okay, bishop h6 played. Okay, king h8. Of course, both rooks are hanging, both exchanges are hanging. But Kramnik has to get away from the g file, because there are a lot of checks that could simply win. Okay, and in this position, after king h8, Arsen Oganyan finally plays like a child and makes a mistake. Up to this point, both sides played an almost perfect game. All the moves that were imprecise were just slightly imprecise. Okay, in this position he plays bishop takes f8, which just loses the game. I'll show you 2 good alternatives. What he could have played is rook b4. That's probably the best move, and after a b4 it seems very dangerous to leave this knight hanging, but you have the move queen f3, and you are threatening mate. So the bishop is hanging, you have to do something about that. Bishop to e7, defending the f6 square, and now rook to g1. Again, going for a perpetual check, and there's basically no way to prevent this. So for example, rook a8, trying to do something, and now bishop g7, and here. This would have been a draw. The alternative after king h8 was the move queen f2. And this, I think, is slightly more aggressive, and if white wants to play for the win, this was the continuation. Of course, threatening a mate in 2 with queen takes f6. So now take on d4, and after rook takes d4 again, if you save your rook with something like rook g8, then queen f6 is checkmate, or rook a8, queen f6 is checkmate. So you have to defend, so you play queen e7 to defend the f6 square, but now bishop f8, queen f8, queen f6, queen g7, and this should be a roughly equal position if 2 engines are playing. If 2 humans are playing, I would give the advantage to black still. Even though he loses the d6 pawn, I think his position is still slightly more pleasant. That being said, both moves were fine. Bishop f8 is not fine. This just loses straight away. Let me show you why. So Kramnik played incredibly from here on. He only missed one opportunity. He took on d4 with the rook. In this position, rook to g1 was played. Okay, starting an attack, and now you can see that black has 2 bishops and the rook. White has bishop, knight, and rook. So the material is equal except for the pawn. And now Kramnik simply has to finish the game. The knight is pinned, the bishop is attacking the knight, the queen is attacking the knight, the rook could transfer to b4 and put pressure on the b3 pawn and on the b2 pawn, but more importantly, simply, if you manage to win the b3 pawn, then the c3 knight is going to be undermined horribly. So he simply plays bishop e4. And now this is a very strong continuation. Now the white king has no squares, and for a young kid to play such a strong move, I was very surprised. Okay, so he's basically taking away squares from the white king. Of course, if queen takes bishop, rook takes bishop, the knight is pinned. If the knight cannot take the bishop, so white tries h4, and I don't know what the idea behind the move is, but that's simply too slow. Rook b4 played. There were better moves, but this is simply good enough. Queen to d2 played, defending the knight, and rook takes b3, and now it's all over. Bishop d6 was played, which is very, very good. Yeah, bishop takes d6 was played by white, which is very good considering the circumstances. And Kramnik played queen b6, which is okay, which attacks both the b2 pawn, the c3 knight is under pressure, you're threatening queen b8, and you're attacking the rook. So this is a very strong move. However, he had a brilliant finish. If you want, you can pause the video and find the move. I think this is his biggest mistake in the game, but what he did is extremely strong as well. So what he could have played is queen takes c3. And now, of course, if queen takes c3, then you play bishop takes c3, and after pawn takes, you have rook to b8, you win the rook, and you win the game. And after queen takes c3, b takes c3, now you simply win with rook b1, checkmate, and that's it. Okay, but after bishop takes d6, he played queen b6, which is still very, very strong. Rook g4 played, which attacks the bishop, but doesn't prevent any of the threats. And Kramnik simply played rook takes c3. Of course, if you take with the queen, I take your queen. If you take with the pawn, it's still checkmate. So an incredible finish by Kramnik. And I think the serious stuff started happening after f6, and I was amazed to see how calm Kramnik was under pressure. So after f6, he simply exchanged. He wasn't afraid to open up the G file, which I think is it shows that he was calm even when he was very young. I think being calm under pressure is one of the biggest traits of strong players. Bishop h6, king h8, very calm, leaving the G file, no counterplay. He doesn't take the rook. And now bishop f8, and his opponent is the one who made the first mistake. Rook takes d4, incredibly strong. Just very, very strong. And bishop takes e4, taking away the squares from the king. Rook b4, he recognized that he needs to put pressure on the c3 knight from the b3 square. Just an incredible finish. The only mistake, as I said, is in this position, after rook takes b3, bishop d6, that he didn't play queen takes c3, which would have been very aesthetically pleasing, but this is incredibly strong too. Okay, so this is the first game. Tomorrow we will continue with a new world champion. Hopefully you like the series. Let me know what you think about the concept, and I hope that we can all learn a lot from these classics. I'm going to be analyzing a ton of games. Again, you can find the PGN of this video on Patreon. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for more chess and see you tomorrow. Bye bye.